My name is Sarah Minnis, and I am the network support for the Rural Governance Network for the RPLC, which this webinar has been brought to you by. We have three exciting presenters that will each do a presentation, and then we'll have a robust discussion afterwards about putting rural on the agenda and the prominence and priority of rural issues and opportunities in policymaking. I just want to give a shameless plug that this is a pre-webinar to a session on the same topic that will be happening at the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation's conference in October in Saskatoon. So there'll be a similar session with 5 other speakers actually from across Canada and internationally talking about the same topic on Thursday, October 11th. 1 p.m. Saskatchewan time, and that will be also webcasted as a webinar similar to this one. So look out in your inbox for details about signing on to that webinar as well if you're interested in this one. So our panelists today, first up we have Norman Ragetlie. He is currently Chief Executive Officer with the Rural Ontario Institute. Hi, Norm. He served for 8 years, from 2010 to 2018, as Director of Policy and Stakeholder Engagement with the Institute. In that role, he engaged with many types of stakeholders, organizations, and led collaborative projects and studies on matters relevant to rural communities. From 2000 to 2010, Norm was with the Provincial Ministry of Agriculture and Food and Rural Affairs, supporting rural community economic development. In the previous decade, Norm was Senior Policy Analyst with Regional Municipal Government. He began his career in the nonprofit sector, managing a food cooperative, as well as coordinating environmental advocacy campaigns. He holds a Master of Science degree in Rural Planning and Development from the University of Guelph, and he has been active in a variety of voluntary roles, including Chair of the Ontario Farmland Trust from 2011 to 2017, and with local community projects. After Norm gives his presentation, we have Dr. Douglas Jackson-Smith, who is a professor and assistant director of the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University in the United States. He is the outgoing president of the Rural Sociological Society. His own research focuses on drivers and impacts of technical and structural change in the food and agricultural system, rural land use change, and interdisciplinary and engaged approaches to improving water sustainability in urban, rural, and agricultural landscapes. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson-Smith, for joining us today. And then last will be Professor Sally Shortall. She is the Duke of Northumberland Chair of Rural Economy at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom. Thank you for joining us, Sally, at 7 p.m. her time. She is interested in rural development, policy, and practice, the role of women on farms and in rural development, social changes in farming practice, and the links between evidence and policy. Thank you very much to all our presenters. This is going to be an exciting session, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy it. Norm, take it away.
So I'm going to talk about, Ontario. That's obviously where Rural Ontario Institute works. So for those of you who may be from other parts of the planet, Ontario's about 13 million people. It's a province in Canada. It's got about 2.5 million rural residents, so people outside the metropolitan areas. So that's about 20% of the population. It's, the Canadian context, of course, a very decentralized federal state. Health and education is all a provincial responsibility, and any residual powers are provincial. So really what the Ontario government can do for rural Ontario is pretty significant from a policy perspective. It's not a real afterthought. It's a pretty important part of the context, the governance context in Ontario. So that's just a bit of backdrop. What I'm going to spend my time on, I think about 15 minutes, I'm just going to explain a little bit about who the Rural Ontario Institute is. I'm going to introduce a little bit of a policy model, as sort of an abstract way of organizing my talk. And really, that's also partly because that we don't really have an integrated rural policy framework in Ontario. I would venture to say there is no rural policy in Ontario. So that's another reason why it's good to have some sort of framework to hang some thinking on. I'm going to talk in relationship to that policy model a little bit about how we try to influence policy as a nonprofit charitable organization. We only have certain buttons we can push, so to speak, and I'll try to walk through sort of 4 sets of examples of how we do our work. So ROI in general has a 2-part mandate. We connect rural stakeholders and facilitate dialogue, and that's sort of the policy influence piece. We also do leadership development, very much with the ag sector, but also organizational development type training and that sort of thing. Those policy functions we have, they're largely supported by government, grants and contribution agreements. We're an independent, objective entity with our own board and so on. But in the sense that we're provided resources by government, that's kind of a tightrope that we walk in terms of connecting stakeholders. And that's really our modus operandi, I guess, is that we're partnering up with a lot of rural stakeholder organizations and facing outward rather than sort of inward. And the leadership development work we do does have tuition and private sponsorship and so on, and much less sort of government support. So the Ontario government does have something that they call a rural plan. It was prepared a few years ago, but it really isn't a plan as such. It's more of a listing of initiatives that the government has undertaken that they feel are helping rural constituencies. So it's not really a locus or a focus of any ongoing program evaluation, policy evaluation. So we don't really spend a lot of time thinking or talking about that rural plan in the Ontario context. So in the absence of that framework, what do we do? So I've just made a little quick map here of what I think of as the rural policy development cycle or the policy development cycle. I'm going to start in the top upper right-hand quadrant there. So that's really the current conditions, the existing realities that are present in rural Ontario, and that leads to public dialogue about what's working, what's not working, what are issues, and what are concerns. So that lower right-hand quadrant is really about the issue identification phase of policy making and getting things on the public agenda. The quadrant over here in the bottom left is really when something becomes a priority, and the analysts and the staff and the specialists sort of take over and start to look at policy options and alternatives, that part of the process, the program development part. And then in the top left quadrant would be the sort of legislative or programs which emerge, and then the government and policy stakeholders are involved in assessing and evaluating and implementing those kind of program and legislative initiatives. So and that presumably has some impact on bettering rural conditions. So then we're back to the top right quadrant. So if we frame things this way, then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we try to act in each one of those 4 quadrants. So first, the upper right-hand quadrant, our role in that really is to try to build a shared understanding of what's happening in terms of rural trends and conditions in Ontario. And we do that through one primary mechanism. It's not the only mechanism, but the main one is that we publish, for the last 5 years, we've been publishing Focus on Rural Ontario fact sheets. Dr. Ray Bowman, who probably is well known to a lot of you folks, is the author of these. And we came up with this format to sort of bullet out descriptive data, just straight up facts about what's happening in rural Ontario. It's really important for us that remain critical and objective, and we don't put a lot of opinion in there about, things. It's really descriptive data. We do take that information, and we've, I think, put together 70 or 80 titles now in the 5 years we've been doing this. Each year we put them under one cover. We send it to all our members of provincial parliament. Those are what we call MPPs. We send it to the opposition critics, to government policy staff, to county wardens caucuses and rural Ontario municipal folks, because we do a lot of work with the municipal sector, and in some ways they can bring priorities to the attention of the provincial government much more readily than we can. They certainly have the ear of the provincial government in a lot of ways. So we work all parts of that spectrum, I guess. So that's the data side, and that's the sort of building a shared understanding. When we get to priority setting, it gets a bit muckier and messier, and in this arena we do a number of different things, but essentially we're trying to raise rural issues on the public agenda. One of the ways we do that is by putting out surveys, lists of issues. We work with the Rural Ontario Municipal Association. This is the result of a 2016 survey of Rural Ontario Municipal Councillors, the top 20 priorities in their communities across the board. And I would venture to say this list of issues doesn't, there's relatively seldom do we get a completely new issue appearing on this list, as we do this, periodically. But sometimes a few hot button issues come in, like that cost of electricity one sort of came in out of the blue. But by and large, a lot of these issues would be typical rural development issues, and they stay on the agenda for a long time. But for us, what's important is to talk to the municipal councillors about what they see as priorities. We also survey other stakeholders and our members, which tend to be a mix of MUSH sector agency people. What I mean by MUSH is, universities, schools, hospitals, other professionals working in rural Ontario, and the private sector. About a third of our subscribers are in the private sector. So we formulate those into questions that go into the election campaign. We publish these provincial election questions. We give them to each party. We ask for their responses. We publish their responses, but we also give it out so that people can ask these questions of their candidates locally. So we try to influence the agenda that way, because often the party platforms aren't necessarily speaking to a lot of rural issues otherwise. We also commission papers, and I'm giving this as an example because David's paper for us, Growth Beyond Cities, Place-Based Rural Development, really actually coalesced a loose coalition of organizations that got together behind the Ontario Federation of Agriculture to promote this notion of prosperity being locally driven, and it was really catalyzed by David's paper. We also try to move things up the agenda by providing a place or a platform for people to speak to other rural folks about what they say is important issues. So this guest blog, for example, is a medical officer of health raising an issue about a new funding formula coming out of the provincial government. So we try to foster informed opinion about some of the new policy emerging out of the provincial government. So that's how we kind of work in that sphere. In the assessment of policy options and the program development, obviously that's not something that we do directly ourselves. We can't really, we're not inside the tent, through those processes. But what we spend a lot of time doing is bringing together local players, local stakeholders, people that are working on solutions to rural challenges, and invite the policymakers so that they're hearing from local stakeholders about policy barriers that they may be meeting as they try to tackle specific issues. So it's a lot of forums, it's a lot of case studies, it's a lot of meetings and talking, sort of publishing stuff. So as I think we all would know, working in rural situations, there are a fair number of sort of complex long-term issues, and those are the ones that we try to stay relevant to. We're not picking hot-button issues and trying to be relevant to that, but rather convening conversations about things over time so we can sustain activities over years, really, and help to build, a common front. Here's an example of, some of those forums. Ryan would be part of SURF, and, Community Foundations of Canada and local foundations. We, put together conversations about learning from one another, really about how to take advantage of some of the programs that are out there. Here's another example about newcomer engagement and social capital in rural communities. So you'll see there's 3 counties there that were highlighted in a summary report. And, in this space, it's very important for us that we connect these stories up with a policy agenda. So by working together with contacts in the municipal government, this was put together a webinar. This is Municipal Exchange, is a platform that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing has to reach stakeholders in the municipal sphere. So we're working with them and sharing that case study information that way. We do some special purpose kind of symposiums. One we did recently was on kind of an econometric thing with 9 ministries, and it was much more kind of oriented at interministry dialogue about how to understand the economic contribution of rural regions. We're very concerned that people do appreciate the interdependence of rural and urban places. I won't talk a lot about this, but we do submit policy briefs when the government is doing formal consultations. And those are just some examples. So on to the last sphere, which is really the implementation, evaluation, assessment stage. We're not that busy in this part, but there's a few things that we do that I think are important to, as maybe examples of how to influence this phase of the policy cycle. And I'll just give you 2 quick ones. One is a project we're doing right now on analyzing 211 service calls for rural unmet human service needs. So around the table, we're creating a shared GIS platform that government data analysts and organizations like United Ways and other regional agencies can use together to try to understand problems and integrate their own data with it. So this is currently underway. We'll probably be wrapping up in September, but it's a shared platform, and we can talk about gaps in human service availability using this data platform together. And the other example I'll give is about community transportation. And we are funded by the Ministry of Transportation to convene a community practice of rural transportation service providers. So there's about 200 or so service providers in this network. And the government runs a grant program. And through this network, they are able to dialogue with people that apply for those grants, get those grants, about how things are going and so on. But it does maintain its own identity and separate, like we do the training and forums sort of separately from the government. So that kind of community of practice can be really useful for policymakers to get in touch with the people they're trying to help ostensibly. So those are some of the ways that we try to influence policy. It probably looks more coherent than it actually is in practice, I would say. It's a lot messier than that.
Well, my name is Doug Jackson-Smith, and I'll just start by saying a couple of things. I'm a rural sociologist, and despite my best efforts to do something useful, I've spent my whole career as an academic and a researcher. And so I think it's really refreshing that we started with Norman's talk, and I want to circle back hopefully at the end to talk about the connections. And when I looked at Norman's slides earlier this week, I realized that he and I are coming at this from slightly different ends of a continuum. I'm going to talk in the very, very broad terms about what my observations are about the way rural has been embraced or not in U.S. policy. And in the U.S. particularly, I think our experience has been that rural, to the extent that it is implemented as policy, has often been reliant upon national and federal government initiatives and funding. So it's unusual to find significant investments outside the national programs, even though there's a plethora of activities and organizations at the grassroots that are very much like Norman's organization. So I'll be talking about three themes, hopefully a little bit of time on each, but leave some time for questions at the very end of our session. The idea about rural being the same as agriculture, and then a couple comments about long-term trends in U.S. policy and recent political events that you may have heard about in the U.S. So the big picture is really that there's a persistent myth in U.S. policy discourse. Probably 35 years ago, I read a book by some of my colleagues when I was a budding rural sociologist about sacred cows and hot potatoes, which argued that there's this agrarian myth that everything rural in America is agricultural. I can say that that myth is well endowed and persistent. Every week when you read political rhetoric or programs and discussions at both the national and the state level, most people will equate rural with agricultural. Now, it is true that when you look down from satellite or you fly across the land, most of our rural landscape, at least in the continental United States, is in some form of agriculture. But it's also true that most rural people don't farm, and many places have very little economic dependence on farming. And so you miss quite a bit of very important rural culture activity and people when you focus only on the agriculture. And it's equally important to realize that farm households, for the most part, no longer rely solely upon agriculture for their sustenance, and non-farm economies, non-farm opportunities and infrastructure are as important to the viability of farming as they are to non-farm households. So one manifestation of the focus of U.S. rural policy is what we call our Farm Bill. It's the single biggest investment we make in all things rural at any level of government. It encompasses a wide variety of topics. These bills get passed about every 5 years, although we're getting worse at doing that. And they focus anything from commodity programs and agricultural insurance programs, nutritional assistance programs, conservation, energy trade. Our big competitive research programs are funded through this legislation, but also the core rural development programs that we have in the U.S. And while I can't get you to answer this on the air, I would sort of throw out as a hypothetical to kind of guess where most of the money goes. In reality, this is the distribution of the Farm Bill passed in 2014 that is due to expire next year, and we'll see if we get our act together to renew it with something different, but if not, they'll extend it. And it's roughly $1 trillion program over 5 years, in which about 70–80% of that money is being spent on nutritional programs. That's the big ticket item. It goes to assistance to needy families and individuals that need help buying food. It's not a luxurious program, but it's a big ticket item because it affects so many people. The rest of the programs are predominantly traditional farm commodity programs, subsidies, crop insurance, or conservation subsidies. There is a small slice of the pie which belongs to rural development and everything else, including the entire research apparatus of the U.S. agricultural agencies. And it's just a big picture reminder that when we think about spending money on things that might affect rural America, we spend most of our money through the lens of agriculture, and then in this case, food subsidies or food support. That said, it's not trivial, the money we spend on rural development. These are the rural development spending levels in recent years within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The lion's share of the money goes to support housing subsidies, and then utilities and infrastructure programs, largely rotational revolving loan programs and grants. Now that money is about $2 to $3 billion a year. If you were to go back and think of the $1 trillion we spend over 5 years, you can see it's a drop in the bucket. It does leverage additional investments, and so we often think of it as more of a $20 to $25 billion of rotating money being spent. So this is a little disingenuous in terms of the total available funds, but the actual allocation of resources is pretty small. We've done a fair amount of work, myself and my colleagues, looking at how different farm bill programs impact rural community well-being. And it's quite clear that spending money on commodity subsidies or crop insurance programs are a very tenuous way to promote rural prosperity in general. The effects that you do get that are positive direct effects tend to be short-term, and then in the long run are often ameliorated through changes in land markets and other factors. And the fact that so many communities don't have a significant agricultural sector and have high need means they're not likely to be on the receiving end. Food and nutrition programs are not usually thought of as rural policy. In fact, the whole dialogue for farm bill politics is you have to get an urban-rural coalition to form, and they see those nutritional programs as entirely urban programs. In fact, when you look at the impact of those programs in rural places, we think they generate far higher net benefits than the farm programs, and this would be true for other social welfare programs, Medicare programs, and other retirement programs that the government operates that we don't think of as rural. There are these rural development programs, primarily in housing and infrastructure. And I'll just show you a few pictures about how I think about the diversity of the US. But if you look across the United States, this is a map of what we think of as rural counties in gray and farming dependent places in green, highlighting how it's really a small subset of the United States rural landscape that's heavily dependent upon agriculture. This would be an illustration of the diversity of population trends in rural America. We have places that are thriving and growing, and their issues have to do with urban pressure and development and preservation of land. And we have places that are experiencing net population loss and outmigration and the collapse of infrastructure and communities. And it's hard to think of a single approach through rural policy that can be appropriate in each of those settings. It rather requires more of a diverse approach. When you think of those farm bill programs that spend most of the money, let me just show you two sets of maps. This is the distribution of those funds at the county level, on the left from farm programs, on the right from the nutritional programs. Nutritional programs is pretty much a map of population in the United States. It's not a program targeted at rural America, but on the left you'll see that there's a high concentration in a few parts of the US where most of that money flows. This is even more dramatic when you factor in the spending per capita. And in those places in which we spend money through farm subsidies and support, we get high concentrations per capita in a very few places, whereas the nutritional programs serve as a universal blanket that actually impacts most of rural America at a relatively high level. Take-homes on US federal rural policy is that we don't really have rural policy. We tend to focus still on agriculture as our main vehicle to address rural policy. Rural development struggles to attract serious funding, and even though all the funding that is available usually originates at the federal level, that's been a shrinking pot and a difficult thing to sustain political support for. Social welfare funding is probably one of the biggest impacts we do have on rural well-being, but is not discussed typically with rural situations in mind. And finally, we have regular major changes, and even more and more these days in the US, with major policy initiatives. And it's quite unusual, despite articulate and vociferous rural advocates trying to raise the profile of rural perspectives. It's very unusual for these to be designed with rural in mind. And there are litany of stories of unintended consequences. For example, when our recent healthcare reform, the Affordable Care Act, was passed, that impacted rural areas in particularly dysfunctional ways that could have been foreseen, but certainly weren't part of the policy dialogue. More broadly, policy in the US has shifted away from federal government support and towards a more neoliberal or market-focused effort. We think of devolution as shifting the responsibility for policy implementation and to some degree for funding down the chain to local government, and neoliberalism as a philosophy that really relies on more and more market mechanisms and privatization. I won't get into any of the details, but there's a long history now of documenting how rural areas in particular are disadvantaged by those large-scale policy shifts in the United States. And this has to do with some of the things that would be intrinsic disadvantages for rural development or economic activity, such as higher poverty and lower income, providing a smaller tax base to raise revenue to implement programs, poor economies of scale for implementation by local governments, and much more expensive service provision because of the low population density, and thus making it quite unattractive in a private competitive market-based calculus. Final slide is that I'll talk a little bit about just the recent election in the US, and it stirred up quite a lot of interest in the issue of the rural voter across the political spectrum and certainly in urban areas. The narrative on our election in 2016 was that it was to some extent decided by a surge in rural voting and a rise in kind of rural culture and politics. I won't get into the realities that the political scientists can walk us through. It's probably overstated, and the election really swung on suburbs and cities, but it does reflect, I think, a signal that there was a critical point in rural politics in which frustration and anger in rural and small town America had bubbled up, and there was higher levels of participation in the rural process, and that higher level of interest was targeted towards primarily that neoliberal and devolutionary-oriented political philosophy. Now, as rural sociologists, we've been excited that people are interested in rural. We get calls from the New York Times to go do interviews. We believe that there's some very fundamental rural issues that are behind the dissatisfaction and malaise in rural America: poverty, the impacts of globalization, the opioid crisis, et cetera. And it provides, in theory, a political window to bring rural more into the national discourse, and certainly more than just agriculture. The reality is, I don't think that's how it's manifested itself, that most of the initiatives that we have seen coming out of the administration have focused on agriculture. There's actually been a lot of efforts to dismantle rural development programs. The position of Undersecretary for Rural Development was eliminated. There were proposals in every year's budget to dramatically cut rural development programs. Rural development councils and centers around the U.S. have all been slated for elimination. And then most recently, the rural data sources, our economic research service, has been under attack with more than a 50% cut in their budget. So you can see the sort of twinning of increased support and vocal support for agriculture, but active undermining of what actually we think would be effective rural policy. Interestingly enough, the other side of the political aisle, the Democrats, are not much better. They have a hard time, I think, developing effective and articulate advocates for rural-focused policy proposals, often don't look to rural constituents as potential supporters in the political sphere. So I will stop.
So like Doug, I'm a hard-boiled sociologist. I'm interested in rural and farming matters. I was seconded to our Department of Agriculture and Rural Development in Northern Ireland when I worked in Belfast for a year, so I have some understanding of your world, Norm. And Doug, I'm working quite a lot with some of your colleagues from Penn State and Cornell on comparative work with the UK. David Brown and I are working on a special issue of a journal at the moment. So it's interesting to think about some of the differences across the pond. Okay, so I'm going to talk about rural policy in the UK, some of the complexities of talking about that, some of the kind of questions that we're grappling with. But really, in order to do that, I need to say something more generally about rural policy in the European Union. So the European Union, well, 28 member states until Brexit happens. And, you know, it very much came out of the Second World War. Member states had experienced hunger, were very committed to increasing agricultural production, and hence the development of the Common Agricultural Policy, which very much focused on agriculture, ate up the bulk of the European budget for various reasons. And then in the 1980s, there was some concern that the kind of underpinning rationale for the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, was that if you had a vibrant agricultural industry and sector, you would have vibrant rural areas. And it very much links to Doug's point that there's a lot more going on in rural areas than agriculture. And in the European Union, there was kind of growing realization that this heavy subsidization of farmers was not leading to, the rising tide that would raise all boats, but actually there were still rural areas that were in decline. So the European Union published a document in 1988 called The Future of Rural Society. And this led to the European development of European rural development programs. So funding was made available as through the Common Agricultural Policy, and you Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 2 still funded some agriculture-related activities, but it also funded rural development. And these were community-led initiatives looking at economic needs in rural areas, very much premised on the idea that you needed local involvement to understand the local rural needs, because of course the European Union is vast, and you're looking at differences between Finland, Ireland, Greece, the Netherlands, for very different demographic compositions, culture, economic, political histories, and so on. There's always sort of been tensions between the agriculture and rural lobbies, and in a sense, it's actually in the way the whole rural development program was developed. So rural development, you could really argue, is kind of tacked on to the back of the Common Agricultural Policy. It has never been funded to the same extent, but at the same time, it's not insignificant funding. So I checked the figures for England. And between 214 and 220, there's 3,471 million pounds available to England from the European Union. Now, the European Union sets particular parameters for how that rural development funding can be used. But I think it's pretty fair to say that rural development policy at a European level has been on the agenda since the kind of late 80s, early 90s. It's been a big part of European rural policy debates and discussion, and it's been a big part of our scholarship. We have looked at the success of different rural development initiatives, and we have considered rural separately to agriculture. And you see that both conceptually and how it's developed and so on. So that's kind of the European level, looking at comparative work that we've done between the EU and the US. There's certainly a much more almost emotive and emotional commitment to keeping rural areas alive in Europe and to maintaining rural communities, and also I think to trying to maintain democratic ownership of the land. So family farming has been heavily subsidized in Europe through the Common Agricultural Policy. And there is that kind of commitment. So then when you come to looking at rural policy in the UK, that's virtually impossible because you've got the 4 devolved regions in the UK. You've got England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And actually you have 4 devolved regional governments, and what rural means in each place is very different. So if you look at Northern Ireland, so Northern Ireland is much more similar to Southern Ireland, and it was a peasant society really, until 96 years ago. The tenants were allowed to buy out the farms. You have very, very small farms. Colleagues of mine, Menelaus Gargis and Mark Schutzsmith, have written a really interesting article comparing planning legislation in England with the Republic of Ireland, where they talk about, apartheid versus anarchy. So people in Ireland will stick up houses wherever they like because it's our land and we own it now and we'll give a plot to all of our children. Whereas in England, rural space is very preserved, it's conserved, and there's much more emphasis given to the conservation lobby. England is the most densely populated country in Europe, and Scotland is really the only region of the UK that has very remote areas with the Highlands and with the islands. The OECD review of rural England, which actually Norm David Freshwater was heavily involved in. We're hoping to have him here as a visitor shortly. By the OECD definition of rural, none of England is rural. But they talked about the emotional and cultural attachment to rural, and they kind of worked with that definition around that. So first of all, it's important to understand that rural means something different in those 4 constituencies. And it's been very much shaped by European rural development policy. So I think it's fair to say rural is on our agenda. We have strong rural lobby groups who argue it's not taken seriously enough, but each of our government departments have rural in their title somewhere. So there is that kind of policy commitment. So I just want to make a number of observations. And one is, I think, how we treat rural we have to recognize how our culture, history, and economics plays into that. And then I want to say something about different power relations within rural policy. So I've said a little bit about the history of Ireland. England, it was the first European country to industrialize. And remember that the elite in England were the large landowners. And, you had the House of Lords and so on. And with the Industrial Revolution, these people were seen as nouveau riche and not having the same privilege and historical birthright as the landed gentry. So, in Ireland, being rural was poor. You were better off to be in industrialized cities. There has always been a lot of privilege in rural England, and there remains so. And we have a lot of societies to protect rural England that have a lot of dukes. Look at my title, the Duke of Northumberland, Chair of Rural Economy, he is one of the largest landowners in England. But, you have a lot of people very committed to the preservation of the beauty of the rural countryside. And if you have ever been to rural England, it's incredibly beautiful. So it's very preserved. It's the only OECD country where it's more expensive to buy a house in a rural area than in an urban one. Now, that's not to say you don't have pockets of deprivation, which of course you do. But, there are social class issues in England. There's a big commitment in England, and England has spearheaded this idea of rural proofing, that all policies should be proofed to make sure they do not disadvantage rural in any way. Northern Ireland, which has only recently had devolved government, still tends to copy English policy, and they've actually legislated for a Rural Needs Act. So they've passed legislation that all policies must take account of economic and social need in rural areas. This Rural Needs Act, it can get a lot of good press. I've just finished some research looking at it in Northern Ireland. It can be really problematic to have that type of a general policy that, coming back to Norm Circle, doesn't clearly have objectives, doesn't identify the actual social problem it's trying to address. So it can look good, sound good, feel good, but then can be quite ineffectual. Scotland has not introduced rural proofing, but they do have specific policies to deal with their remote, rural, highland, islands, places. Then I want to just come back, Norm, to your comment about trying to agree shared priorities for rural policy. And I just wonder if that's possible, because, you know, we have different interest groups and different power relations, and people will want to advocate what they see as the right thing for rural policy. So, you know, farmers will want specific things like no interfering in their rights to build their own farm buildings, and they will see the countryside as a productive space, and that's the priority. Developers will see it as, you know, grants to build houses, to develop leisure activities, and so on. So they'll have particular interests. Preservationists will be coming at this from a particular view, want to maintain heritage and not have new buildings and so on. Environmentalists will have a different approach of how they want this space maintained. And then, you know, leisure groups will want access to be able to walk in particular parts, to have access to fishing rights and so on. So I think, you know, I think public policy is always contested, and there are different interest groups. And I think, you know, we have to kind of be mindful of those types of struggles. And I think I'm going to leave it there. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doug, Norman, and Sally for sharing that information with us. It was very informative. For those in the audience, if you have any questions, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, I would just ask that you put your questions in there. That way they can get asked. So there is one question from Kathleen. She says, ideas for how might policy proofing be enhanced for Canada?
I'll say something about that if you like, because I talked about rural proofing. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So there has been some talk about the rural lens, the Canadian rural lens, and I know that Ryan Gibson has done some interesting work on that. And he's actually involved in a project that some of us are getting off the ground to look at exactly this question of how to make rural proofing more effective. And I think from the research I've been involved in Northern Ireland, there are a couple of lessons. I think the first one is to clearly identify the rural issue. So to come back to Norm's circle, and he talked about using Ray Bullman's fact sheets. So there should be a clear understanding of what is the issue, what's the problem, what's the need, and then how this approach can help to address that public policy issue. I also think, and certainly for Canada, there needs to be cognizance of the fact that you have very different rurals. So, you know, around Guelph is very different to Thunder Bay, to, you know, very remote parts of BC. So you will need very differentiated kind of proofing approaches in order to deal with the very, very different issues that different parts of Canada will deal with. I think the broad catch-all, rural proofing all policies is perhaps not the most helpful way to go about it, because it becomes so general, it's meaningless.
Yeah, and if I could follow Sally's remarks there, I mean, the Rural Affairs mandate is located in one ministry, you know, by title, but their capacity as a ministry in terms of their influence on other ministries' agendas is pretty low. So, like, internal to government, that dedication, let's say, to looking at their policy making through a rural lens is, not going to be driven by the Ministry of Rural Affairs, or in our case, the Ministry of Ag, Food and Rural Affairs. So I do think if it's going to happen, it's going to happen because there are people assigned the task of looking through, I would agree with Sally, looking through a geographic lens at potential policy impacts. So that isn't necessarily just rural, but looking at, and the Ministry of Health in Ontario certainly has put out, policy documents around health equity from a geographic perspective and different populations. So there are examples where a geographic lens is being put on policy, and that can, therefore escape that conundrum of having one identity of rural that seems to be rather than, the regional variation that we see from northern to agrarian to, cottage country type settings in rural Ontario. So I think if we start talking in those terms, regional or geographic, we might get further in influencing the agenda.
Thank you, Sally and Norman. So we do have another question. It's from Roddy. So the question is coming from Ontario, so directed a bit to Norm. If we take current population and economy trends and projects out 30 years, rural Ontario will be not a pretty sight. So has or could Ontario undertake a vision process to ask where do we want rural Ontario to be, and then ask how do we get there?
So if we look at the data about population change, there are many parts of, small rural communities which are growing and have been consistently growing, others stable and others declining. So it really does matter where you are. I don't think, if you look at it globally, the main factor in terms of the declining proportion of rural residents is urbanization. So there are many rural communities in the periphery of urban centers which are experiencing urbanization pressures, and their challenges, which I think Doug was referring to, are quite different than places that have been bleeding population, for a long period of time. So a singular vision is not going to emerge from that diversity. But I do think in Ontario, we need to have conversations and in the places to grow legislation that we have around the land use planning side of things, there are opportunities for multi-stakeholder dialogues. I think the province has the legislative mechanism in growth planning framework. We just haven't applied it to all the landscapes of Ontario. We've only applied it in the GTA, which is the Greater Toronto Area, sort of conurbation, which is a big blob in the center of Ontario, which is swallowing up quite a bit of the countryside. So I think we need to use those tools that were invented for that context and bring them to other contexts. They'll look different, they'll feel different. I think if you talk to Northerners, there's very mixed opinions about whether the Northern Growth Plan, worked or not, or was of any value, and we can probably learn from those lessons as well. That was, in my view, too big a geography to try to tackle all at once in that kind of vision way. So I think we have to get the scale right, and then we can get the dialogue going properly. That's my answer anyway.
Good one.
Okay, we have another question. It's from Bill. Do you have any examples where urban participants or policymakers are included in discussions of rural visions? Anything we can learn from this?
Where they are involved in rural visions. Sorry, will you repeat the question?
Do you have any examples where urban participants / policymakers are included in discussions of rural visions? Anything we can learn from this?
I can think of one example. I was involved in the OECD report looking at urban-rural interactions, and I did a number of the case studies, and one of the ones I did was the Netherlands. And that was really interesting because we looked at the Brabant region of the Netherlands, and they're so worried about losing their rural spaces that they're deeply committed to maintaining green space in the Netherlands because they realize the value of it for social well-being, for, you know, just having those interactions. And I find that really interesting, that there was this deep commitment because they were terrified that it might disappear. But this comes back again to scale. And yeah, I think to scale and how remote is rural from its urban counterparts, because really all of the Netherlands is urban adjacent. Well, maybe there's a bit in the north that isn't, but that would be incredibly different to Canada and the US. But I think it's a really good question, and I think you need rural and urban commitments to both, because of course they're very tightly interlinked.
It's probably my experience that the urban is more interested in the rural than the rural expects the urban to be. And
I think that's a good observation. Yeah.
I think the fact is that the narrative that rural, at least in the United States context, has gravitated towards in the last 30 years is such a politicized and interestingly, almost against their own interest, kind of characterization of the rural, which doesn't necessarily resonate with urban constituents. And there's a missed opportunity there for finding areas of overlap and common interest. I see that more in the European discussions where they celebrate the rural countryside within urban discourse and feel good advocating for resources that aren't just farm programs, but also rural livelihood and rural landscape. You don't hear that as much in the United States context, and I'm puzzled why that political coalition has never emerged.
Mm.
Okay, I have one more question, and it's from Gordon. And he is wondering if each of the speakers might identify one recent policy initiative that would identify that in their mind has really helped rural development in a region, state, or province.
You want to start us, Norman?
Yeah, happy to. I think my last slide talked about that community transportation program. It was long overdue, and it's probably doesn't have enough resources in it. But as a start, it's a signal that you know, there's a recognition that mobility is one of the realities and mobility challenges, access to services, distance. You know, that's the rural reality, and the fact that rather than looking at that through an urban transit lens, you know, because all the transit programs, of course, don't reach, you know, small towns and rural areas. And in Ontario, at least, you know, we're using gas tax money to fund transit programs, and rural residents put a lot of gas in their vehicles. So they've been contributing to it, but the revenues have been going into urban centers. The community transportation granting program was the first signal that that's been recognized and changing. So I think it's an early signal. I can't say that the $40 million that they're providing has made a huge impact yet, but certainly from the local stakeholders that it really has helped move some significant initiatives along. So there's an example. It's in that fairly narrow space of transportation and mobility.
I'll give you two. I think the European Leader program, which was the initiative that kind of brought rural community groups, grassroots groups, or helped develop them to implement rural development policy, has it was very positive in developing a kind of vocal and aware infrastructure across rural Europe. And that, I think, has been very positive. And leader groups, you know, there were opportunities for them to do exchanges and learn about how they were approaching rural development issues differently in different places. The second example I can think of also relates to transportation, Norm. And this was in Northern Ireland, where the work was done with community groups, but it was more around social isolation of older people. So it wasn't that you needed more buses, but somehow you needed to get up to older people living up lanes so that somebody could bring them to do grocery shopping or to pick up prescriptions or for a doctor's visit. And there was kind of a community initiative developed with local people where their cars were used, because it wasn't about providing more buses.
Yeah, probably the example I would point to is something similar in the sense of Sally's first example of efforts that support and embolden rural actors at the regional and local level to collaborate and cooperate in planning infrastructure development, economic development initiatives. There's a host of them that pop up periodically across the US that have, by all accounts, been some of the most transformative and impactful, just broad approaches to move from competing small, poorly resourced actors and converting that into a kind of a collaborative network that allows them to look more broadly at how they can all kind of get more out of coordinating their economic development activities across the rural landscape. And it serves the same function of creating a leadership group, creating a vision and an identity for what a positive story about rural development and rural America looks like. That's where you'll find it in the US, is those kinds of organizations.
I believe that these are all our questions. Is there anything else you guys would like to add?
No, I think I'm ready to go.
Okay. I would like to thank Dr. Doug, Norman, and Sally for your great presentation, as well as the audience for attending and for their participation. Again, thanks to everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Great. Night for me. It was nice to meet you all.
Thanks for having us.
Meet you all. Take care.
Here you go.